Do you remember those lost soul foods black folks created from almost nothing? These meals were born in kitchens where scraps became feasts and love stretched further than money ever could. What do we lose when the taste of survival disappears from our tables? Neckbone stew was a dish that came from both poverty and genius. In kitchens that owned more will than wealth, neckbones were slow simmered until the meat slipped right off and blended with the broth like silk. The smell alone carried across yards, filling homes with warmth that no coin could buy. It was a stew that turned waste into nourishment, where each bone told a story of patience and pride. Families often cooked it on weekends when they had a little time and a lot of mouths to feed. A few onions, a pinch of salt, and maybe a carrot or two if luck allowed. Nothing fancy, yet everything that mattered. The magic was in the time it took, not the price of the ingredients. Children grew up waiting for that bubbling pot, knowing it meant everyone would eat well that night. The first spoonful always felt like a reward, the kind that only hard work and faith could earn. Neckbone stew was more than a meal. It was a symbol of how far resourcefulness could stretch. It was living proof that love could turn even the humblest scrap into a feast worth remembering. Red beans and rice was the heartbeat of every humble table across the South. Born from the Creole kitchens of Louisiana, it stretched a handful of beans into meals that could last an entire week. Mondays were often wash days, and this dish cooked low and slow while the clothes dried on the line. Families would toss in whatever scraps of meat they had left, some sausage ends, a bone, or a little ham hock for flavor. The beans softened in the pot, soaking up every bit of smoky spice and salt. Rice gave it body, a soft and filling base that turned the dish into pure sustenance. The aroma of garlic, onion, and pepper filled every small house, making even the leanest days feel abundant. It was a dish that reminded people of home no matter where life took them. Each bite carried warmth, comfort, and history in equal measure. Red beans and rice wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline, a way for families to fill their bellies with dignity. It proved that flavor doesn't come from cost, but from care, time, and the will to make something beautiful from almost nothing. Collard greens with ham hocks were a kind of southern poetry in a pot. Every batch began with water, greens, and a meaty ham hock that filled the kitchen with the scent of home. The greens simmered slowly, wilting into something rich and earthy while the hock gave off its smoky depth. This wasn't a quick meal. It was an act of devotion, a ritual that demanded time and patience. Every generation had its own trick for getting them just right. Maybe a dash of vinegar, a sprinkle of sugar, or a secret seasoning passed down by word of mouth. Collards carried pride, not pity. They were the food of workers, field hands, and families that knew the meaning of resilience. Served alongside cornbread, they became the soul of Sunday dinners, a moment when everyone gathered to taste a little peace after a week of hard living. The broth, or potlikker, was so treasured it was sipped from cups when the greens were gone. In every spoonful was survival seasoned with hope. Collard greens with ham hocks stood as proof that even in the toughest times, comfort could still be coaxed from the simplest things. Hot water. Cornbread was the sound of sizzling batter and the smell of home. With just cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, cooks created a golden miracle that fed whole families for pennies. It was crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and tasted like the countryside itself. The beauty of it was in its simplicity. No milk, no eggs, no fuss, just skill and heat. Each cake was fried in cast iron, often in saved bacon grease that gave it a smoky edge. Children would snatch them off the pan before they cooled, blowing on them between bites. It paired with everything, greens, beans, or stew, but it never needed company to shine. Hot water cornbread taught generations that good food came from the hands, not the wallet. It was born out of necessity but carried the pride of invention. The sound of cornmeal hitting the skillet was like a heartbeat, steady and sure, in homes that had seen hard times. A simple mix of grain and grit, it embodied the spirit of those who refused to go hungry or hopeless. Hot water. Cornbread was survival turned into comfort, one crispy bite at a time. Pig's feet with vinegar sauce were not for the impatient or the faint-hearted. They demanded long hours of boiling and careful cleaning before the meat turned silky soft and rich with flavor. For many families, this dish represented endurance itself, transforming what others threw away into a delicacy that filled the soul. The vinegar cut through the heaviness, adding a tang that woke the taste buds and stretched the appetite. When cooked just right, the gelatin shimmered, thickening the sauce and coating every tender bite. Pig's feet weren't glamorous, but they were honest. They told the truth about survival, about making something from nearly nothing and taking pride in it. Around tables, they sparked stories and laughter, the kind only shared by people who'd known struggle and joy in equal measure. The smell of that vinegar sauce carried through neighborhoods like a promise that good eating didn't need riches. It reminded everyone that patience, thrift, and skill could turn even the roughest ingredients into a dish worthy of celebration. Pig's feet with vinegar sauce were a triumph of flavor and faith, proof that nothing worth keeping ever comes easy. Hoppin John was more than food. It was a wish whispered into every new year and a memory of old fields and family prayers. Made from black-eyed peas, rice, and a scrap of salted pork, it carried a meaning far greater than its humble parts. Each bowl symbolized luck, wealth, and resilience, a quiet hope for better days ahead. Born on plantations where ingredients were scarce, Hoppin John turned survival into tradition. The peas represented coins, the rice abundance, and the pork, the flavor of prosperity. It became a holiday staple across generations, cooked in cast-iron pots and served with greens on the side. The slow simmer filled homes with comfort, while the taste spoke of endurance. People didn't just eat Hoppin John, they believed in it. It was a way to honor ancestors who worked the land and still found joy in sharing a simple meal. Every spoonful connected past to present, hardship to hope. In the rhythm of the South, Hoppin John remains a dish that keeps faith alive, proving that luck can be cooked, shared, and passed down like love itself. Fried cabbage with bacon grease was the meal you made when the pantry looked bare, but your will stayed strong. A head of cabbage, a bit of onion, and a spoonful of saved bacon grease could stretch into supper for an entire family. The crackle of the skillet filled the kitchen like music, turning simple leaves into something rich and smoky. This dish carried the scent of thrift and memory, the kind that lingered long after the plates were empty. The secret was balance, enough fat for flavor, enough salt for soul, and enough patience to let it caramelize just right. Cabbage may have been cheap, but it was treated like gold by those who knew its worth. Served hot with a piece of cornbread or rice, it became proof that a meal didn't have to be fancy to feel like a blessing. Fried cabbage with bacon grease was more than sustenance. It was pride in a pan. Each bite told a story of survival, of turning scarcity into satisfaction. It was the art of making the ordinary taste extraordinary, one skillet at a time. Okra and tomato stew was a dish where heritage met hunger and turned it into comfort. Born from African roots and southern soil, it blended the earthiness of okra with the tang of ripe tomatoes in a thick, bubbling pot. The slime that many feared became silk under the right hands, thickening the stew into a rich, flavorful broth. Onions, garlic, and a few peppers added depth, while a dash of salt or cayenne made the flavors sing. Families often served it over rice or ate it plain with a piece of cornbread, wiping the last drops from their plates. This dish wasn't just food. It was identity, a reflection of generations who made do and made magic. It connected farm to family, past to present, and hunger to heart. The smell alone carried memories of warm kitchens and laughter that refused to fade. Okra and tomato stew was a promise that no ingredient was too humble to become beautiful. It was the taste of tradition kept alive, no matter the hardship, and a reminder that every simmering pot held more than flavor. It held history. Sweet potato biscuits were the soft-spoken stars of every humble table. Made from mashed sweet potatoes, flour, and a touch of lard, they carried the sweetness of the earth and the strength of those who planted it. Each biscuit came out of the oven golden, warm, and smelling like home. Sweet potatoes were a gift crop, tough enough to thrive when others failed, and they carried families through hard seasons. These biscuits stretched what little was available into something that felt like luxury. They were eaten for breakfast with syrup or alongside greens and stew at supper. No matter when, they always brought a comfort that money could not buy. The dough was often mixed by hand, shaped on worn counters, and baked in cast iron. The rhythm of making them passed from mother to daughter like a blessing. Sweet potato biscuits were proof that sweetness could come from struggle, that even the humblest harvest could rise high in the oven and on the heart. They fed not just the body but the spirit, turning hardship into hope with every tender bite. Catfish stew was born from the rivers that fed hungry families when money could not. It was a fisherman's meal, made with whatever the day's catch brought in and whatever else could be spared. The fish simmered with onions, peppers, and a few spices until the broth turned hearty and golden. Sometimes a few potatoes or tomatoes joined the pot to stretch the servings further. The flavor was bold, earthy, and honest, born of water, labor, and faith. Along the banks of muddy rivers, folks gathered to clean, season, and cook together, turning scarcity into celebration. Every spoonful tasted of resilience, the kind that came from knowing you could always find a way. Catfish stew wasn't just dinner, it was fellowship, a gathering around the fire with laughter and storytelling. Even when the world seemed empty, this stew filled bellies and hearts alike. It was the living memory of a people who found abundance in places others overlooked, a symbol of perseverance floating in a pot of simple, sustaining joy. Pan-fried gizzards were the kind of meal that proved patience was as important as any spice. Tough and chewy at first, these scraps of poultry were transformed through slow cleaning, seasoning, and frying into golden bites of pride. A bowl of seasoned flour, a splash of buttermilk, and a hot cast-iron skillet were all it took to turn what most people ignored into something worth gathering for. The gizzards hissed in oil until they were crisp on the outside and tender within, each one carrying the smoky taste of hard work and heart. Families would pile them high on paper towels, watching the steam rise like a promise that dinner was ready. Every batch felt earned, every crunch a reminder that flavor came from care, not wealth. Children gnawed at the edges, soaking the last bits in hot sauce, while elders nodded in approval. Pan-fried gizzards were food that spoke of resourcefulness, a celebration of making something special from nothing. They filled kitchens with the sound of sizzling survival, the scent of seasoning that lingered long after the plates were empty. In every bite was proof that thrift could taste like triumph. Molasses bread was the sweetness that softened hard weeks. Made from sorghum or cane syrup, it was a dark, sticky loaf that baked up rich and fragrant even when sugar was scarce. A single jar of syrup could stretch through countless loaves, turning thrift into comfort. It came out of the oven glossy and dense, the kind of bread you sliced thin to make it last longer. The taste was deep and earthy, sweet without being showy, a flavor born from the fields where sorghum stalks waved in the sun. On Sundays, families shared it warm with butter or a drizzle of leftover syrup, its smell filling every corner of home. The crust held a quiet crunch, while the inside stayed soft, like memory itself. It was both humble and proud, a loaf that didn't need fancy ingredients to feel like celebration. For people who knew want, molasses bread was a small luxury, a reward for making it through the week. Each slice carried the warmth of family hands and the sweetness of work well done. In every crumb was proof that joy could rise from scarcity and bake into something lasting. Cowpea soup simmered like a prayer whispered over a fire. The pot would start with water, a scoop of dried field peas, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the week had been kind. Onions and garlic joined in, releasing their scent as the broth thickened into something golden and strong. The cowpeas, small and sturdy, softened slowly, their flavor deepening with every hour. This wasn't fast food, it was patient food, built on rhythm and time. Families made it during harvest, when work was hard and hands needed warmth. It was ladled into tin bowls and passed around without ceremony, each bite grounding you in gratitude. Sometimes cornbread floated on top like an offering, soaking up the last drops of broth. The soup tasted of earth and labor, of simple things done well. Cowpea soup was both meal and memory, tying together generations who had learned how to make plenty out of little. It was food for body and spirit alike, humble but whole, strong but soothing. Even now, its scent carries the same promise, that comfort comes from what you give, not what you have. Smothered pork chops turned thrift into something tender and rich. In small kitchens where nothing was wasted, a little flour, onion, and grease could turn a cheap cut into a dish that felt like Sunday. The chops sizzled in cast iron until browned, then simmered under a blanket of thick gravy that pulled every bit of flavor from the bones. The air would fill with the smell of caramelized onion and seasoned fat, the kind of scent that made you stop and smile before supper even began. Rice or mashed potatoes waited on the side, ready to soak up every drop. Smothered pork chops weren't about perfection, they were about care. The sauce was stirred slow, the meat turned gentle, and time did the rest. Families ate in silence at first, just the sound of forks scraping plates and sighs of satisfaction. This dish was kitchen wisdom at its best, turning small means into deep comfort. It was a meal that spoke softly, but stayed with you long after, reminding you that home could always be found in a pan of gravy. Chitterlings or chitlins were the soul food that tested both patience and pride. They came from the parts no one else wanted, the hog intestines that had to be scrubbed, boiled, and seasoned with care to become something worth serving. The cleaning took hours, sometimes a full day, and only those with strong hearts and stronger stomachs stayed the course. But once the pot began to simmer, the air filled with the unmistakable smell of heritage, raw, real, and unashamed. Chitlins were more than a meal. They were a connection to ancestors who made beauty out of burden. Seasoned with vinegar, pepper, and love, they became soft, savory ribbons of history. Every plate told a story of survival and pride, of people who refused to waste what life gave them. Around holidays, families gathered to prepare them together, laughing, talking, remembering. It wasn't fancy food, it was freedom food, built from endurance and ingenuity. To eat chitlins was to honor struggle and triumph in the same bite, proof that dignity could be slow-cooked into something unforgettable. Cracklin cornbread was the kind of food that crackled both in sound and in spirit. It began like any simple cornbread, but what made it sing were the bits of crispy pork skin mixed into the batter. Those tiny pieces sizzled as it baked, releasing flavor and scent that filled every corner of the house. Each bite carried a perfect contrast, crunchy, salty cracklin against the soft, golden crumb. It was a poor man's luxury, a way to stretch leftovers into something that felt like plenty. Made in heavy skillets, it came out with a crisp edge and a tender heart, just like the people who made it. Cracklin cornbread was never wasted. It was eaten with beans, stew, or even by itself when times were lean. The taste reminded families of fields, fires, and full bellies after long days. It wasn't just food, it was triumph baked in cornmeal and grease. For those who knew struggle, it was a warm reminder that joy didn't have to be bought. Cracklin cornbread proved that even scraps could shine when touched with care. Fried green tomatoes were born from gardens that didn't wait for ripeness. When the first chill of the season came, folks picked what was left and turned those hard, tart fruits into something golden. Each slice was dipped in cornmeal, salt, and maybe a pinch of cayenne before hitting the hot oil. The sizzle filled the kitchen with anticipation, and soon the edges browned into crispy perfection. The result was tangy, crunchy, and bright. A surprise of flavor from something most would toss aside. Fried green tomatoes weren't wasteful. They were wise. They showed how ingenuity could turn limitation into delight. Families ate them hot, sometimes with gravy or between slices of bread, savoring the mix of sour and savor. They were the taste of transition, of seasons changing and hands adapting. In every crisp bite was a lesson passed down quietly. Nothing should go unused, and patience is a form of love. Fried green tomatoes may have started as necessity, but they ended as Southern tradition, proof that creativity could turn the unripe into the unforgettable. Sugar drip pie was dessert for the days when sweetness seemed out of reach. Born from scarcity, it used nothing more than flour, butter, and a syrup made from sugar, molasses, or sorghum. The filling bubbled thick in the oven, settling into a caramelized custard that smelled like home. There were no apples, no berries, no milk, just imagination and a deep craving for something sweet. The crust, often rolled thin to save on ingredients, baked to a perfect crispness, holding the sticky richness within. This pie wasn't about indulgence, it was about gratitude. Families sliced it into small pieces, savoring every bite like a treasure. The taste was deep and smoky, with hints of burnt sugar that reminded people of what endurance could create. Sugar drip pie was proof that luxury didn't come from plenty. It came from the hands that made do. It turned simplicity into satisfaction and reminded everyone that joy doesn't need abundance to feel complete. A bite of it could make even the hardest day end a little softer. Mustard greens with cornmeal dumplings were the kind of meal that warmed both the body and the soul. The greens simmered low in a pot of broth, their bitterness mellowed by time and a scrap of salt meat if fortune allowed. Then came the dumplings, cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt mixed by hand and dropped into the bubbling pot. They soaked up the flavor, swelling into tender pillows that turned broth into sustenance. The smell filled the home with earthy comfort, the kind that came from gardens and grit. It was a dish made from what was on hand, proof that no pantry was ever too bare for a good meal. Families gathered around the pot, sharing bowls of steaming greens that tasted like nourishment and memory. The broth, rich and golden, was sipped down to the last drop. Mustard greens with cornmeal dumplings reminded everyone that simplicity could still be a feast. It was food for working hands and grateful hearts, born of scarcity but seasoned with love. Stewed chicken necks and rice was the definition of making the most out of what little you had. The necks, often discarded by others, were slow cooked until their meat fell away and flavored the broth with a depth that money couldn't buy. Onions, peppers, and garlic joined in, transforming a handful of bones into something rich and hearty. The rice soaked it all up, turning plain grains into a meal that could feed many. It was food made from gratitude, a reminder that nothing from the bird should go to waste. Children grew up loving the taste, unaware that it came from thrift. Elders called it wisdom in a pot, and they weren't wrong. The stew was thick, flavorful, and comforting, carrying warmth to the end of every spoonful. It filled bellies and hearts alike, leaving no hunger behind. Stewed chicken necks and rice was the quiet triumph of kitchen survival, the art of stretching scraps into something that could make a family smile. In every bite was the truth that love, not luxury, made food taste whole. Blackstrap molasses pudding was the kind of dessert that proved sweetness could survive even in the hardest times. It came from the sticky leftovers scraped from syrup barrels, the same syrup that once fueled plantation workers through long, back-breaking days. The thick, dark molasses gave the pudding a deep, almost smoky flavor that stayed with you long after the last bite. Eggs, flour, and a pinch of baking soda were all it needed to rise into something soft and rich. The pudding baked slowly, its surface caramelizing into a glossy brown crust, while the inside stayed dense and comforting. It wasn't fancy, but it felt special, a reward earned through labor and love. Families served it warm with a drizzle of syrup or just plain, savoring the heavy sweetness that filled the air. Every spoonful carried history, the taste of survival mixed with pride. Blackstrap molasses pudding was more than dessert. It was resilience turned golden brown, proof that even the simplest ingredients could still bring joy to the table. It lingered like memory itself, dark, strong, and impossible to forget. Fried catfish nuggets were the kind of food that tasted like freedom and the river that gave it. Freshly caught catfish were cut into small chunks, dredged in cornmeal, and dropped into hot oil until they turned golden and crisp. The smell of frying fish drifted across porches and fields, calling everyone home to eat. Seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a little cayenne, they crackled when bitten, revealing tender white meat inside. The nuggets were cheap, easy, and full of flavor, a fisherman's reward that turned scarcity into plenty. Kids would eat them hot from the pan, their fingers greasy and smiling through the crunch. They were shared at church picnics, fish fries, and neighborhood gatherings, always piled high on paper plates with a side of bread or slaw. Fried catfish nuggets weren't just about taste, they were about togetherness, about feeding everyone from the same catch. Each bite carried the flavor of patience, of mornings spent by the river and nights spent feeding family. It was the South's gift to itself, a small joy that reminded folks that even the simplest meals could feel like a feast. Hogmaw and potatoes was a dish that turned thrift into comfort and labor into flavor. Hogmaw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was scrubbed clean, seasoned, and stuffed with diced potatoes, onions, and spices before being boiled to tenderness. The scent filled the house with something hearty and homegrown, proof that nothing from the hog ever went to waste. Families who made it knew that the best meals didn't come from the finest cuts. They came from resourceful hands. The flavor was rich, earthy, and satisfying, a balance between the soft potatoes and the chewy, savory casing. It was the kind of food that stuck with you, not just in the belly, but in memory. Hogmaw and potatoes was about resilience, about stretching what little you had into something that felt whole. It was shared at big tables after church, on holidays, or any day that called for gratitude. To outsiders, it might have seemed humble, but for those who grew up on it, it tasted like home and history wrapped in one. A meal like this didn't just feed the body, it fed the pride of making plenty out of almost nothing. Sweet potato pie, without milk, was the kind of ingenuity that kept sweetness alive when the cupboard ran dry. Made from mashed sweet potatoes, eggs, and a touch of sugar or syrup, it baked into a golden custard without needing cream or milk. The natural starch of the potatoes gave it the same soft texture and comforting warmth. Every family had their own twist. Some used cinnamon or nutmeg, others poured a little molasses to deepen the flavor. It was dessert born from hardship, yet it carried the richness of memory and care. Sweet potatoes were a gift of the land, hardy enough to survive droughts and poor soil, and they found their way into everything from biscuits to pies. This pie, though simple, felt sacred, a treat that honored both thrift and creativity. The crust browned along the edges while the filling glowed like sunset. It was served with pride even on the leanest tables. Sweet potato pie without milk showed that luxury wasn't a matter of ingredients but of heart. It proved that sweetness, once shared, could make scarcity taste like abundance. Turnip greens and root mash were proof that a single plant could feed a family twice. The greens were boiled with a scrap of salt pork or a spoon of lard, turning bitter leaves into tender comfort. The roots, set aside, were mashed with butter or drippings to serve the next day. Nothing was wasted, not even the water, which became a nourishing broth. This kind of cooking wasn't just practical. It was an act of care, of turning necessity into nourishment. The greens carried iron and flavor, the roots brought warmth and substance, and together they filled more than stomachs. Around the dinner table, bowls of greens and mash reminded families that even in scarcity, creativity was endless. The smell of turnips simmering on the stove was a familiar sign of survival, the quiet hum of resourceful living. It was the taste of farm and field, of families who knew how to make something out of every part of what they grew. Turnip greens and root mash were humble but mighty, a simple duet of flavors that sang of hard work and gratitude. Cornmeal mush with syrup was one of those meals that stretched across all hours of the day. Breakfast, lunch, or supper, it didn't matter. Cornmeal, water, and salt simmered together until thick and smooth, then served hot or chilled depending on the season. Poured into pans, it set firm enough to slice and fry the next morning, making it twice as useful. A drizzle of syrup or molasses turned it from plain to comforting, a sweetness that brightened even the hardest days. For families with little more than meal and imagination, it was a lifeline. The smell of corn and syrup filled small kitchens, the kind that held laughter and quiet conversation over cheap enamel plates. Every spoonful carried history, the same kind of simple nourishment that had kept people alive for generations. Cornmeal mush with syrup was survival food that didn't apologize for its simplicity. It taught that a warm bowl and a little sweetness were sometimes all a person needed. In its plainness was peace, and in its thrift was a kind of grace that could never be bought. Cabbage and neckbone soup was the smell of winter comfort simmering in a single pot. Neckbones, rich with flavor, boiled slow until the meat loosened and filled the broth with depth. Shredded cabbage and onions joined next, softening in the heat until everything blended into one hearty stew. It was a dish that used what was on hand, bones from the butcher, cabbage from the garden, and stretched it far enough to feed every hungry mouth. The flavor was smoky, simple, and satisfying, the kind of meal that quieted a room with the first spoonful. Steam fogged up kitchen windows as families gathered close, sharing warmth from both the food and the company. It wasn't grand dining, but it was good eating, honest and earned. Cabbage and neckbone soup reminded people that comfort didn't come from wealth, but from togetherness. The broth lingered thick on the tongue, a mix of labor and love that filled more than the belly. It was a soup that told a story of frugality, endurance, and flavor found in the bones of survival. Candied yams with drippings were the meeting of sweet and savory in the same battered pan. Yams, sliced thick, were layered with brown sugar or molasses and a spoonful of leftover meat drippings to give them body and shine. As they baked, the sugar caramelized, the fat melted, and everything fused into a glossy glaze that clung to every piece. The scent was rich and homey, a mix of comfort and invention. Families didn't need butter or cream to make it taste indulgent, just a little sugar and saved grease. It was food that turned scraps into something beautiful, a rare luxury in lean years. Candied yams with drippings were served during holidays and on ordinary Sundays, a treat that connected both celebration and survival. They were soft, sticky, and sweet in all the right ways, grounding people in the idea that love made every dish richer. When the pan came to the table, it was a symbol of transformation, the kind that only hunger and hope could create. Even now, that blend of sugar and soul lingers as a taste of perseverance. Fried fatback and biscuits were the workers' feast, the kind of meal that tasted like a well-earned rest. Strips of salted fatback were fried until they turned crisp and golden, their grease saved to brush over hot biscuits straight from the oven. The smell alone was enough to lift tired spirits after long days in the field or factory. The biscuits, tender and flaky, soaked up the salty richness until every bite melted together in perfect balance. It wasn't fancy, but it was fulfilling, the kind of food that made a person feel whole again. Children would fight over the last piece while parents smiled, knowing there was pride in providing something so simple yet satisfying. Fried fatback and biscuits told a story of work, faith, and endurance, where flavor was wrung from every bit of effort. It was a reminder that food didn't need luxury to carry love. Each bite crackled with warmth and memory, proof that comfort could be built from the humblest pantry. Fried fatback and biscuits were more than breakfast. They were a quiet victory on every plate. Field peas and fatback salad was a dish that turned yesterday's leftovers into today's blessing. The field peas, soft and seasoned from the pot, were chilled and mixed with bits of fried fatback, onions, and a dash of vinegar. The result was hearty, tangy, and satisfying, a perfect example of never wasting a thing. Served cold on hot days, it was refreshing but filling, a salad born from thrift and imagination. The peas carried the earth's flavor, the fatback added richness, and the vinegar gave it brightness that cut through the heat. Families often made it after Sunday suppers, letting nothing go to waste from the big pot of peas cooked earlier in the week. It was food that honored hard work and conservation, a tradition passed down quietly in kitchens where every bite mattered. Field peas and fatback salad proved that resourcefulness was its own kind of artistry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was genuine, made with care, shared with love, and remembered with pride. In every spoonful was the reminder that waste not only cost food, It cost history. Pea hull broth was a whisper of a meal, simple but steady. It started after shelling peas for supper, when the hulls piled high in the bowl. Instead of tossing them, families boiled them down into a thin, tea-colored broth. The scent filled the room, earthy and green, like the smell of gardens after rain. Some added salt, others a small spoon of butter, but most drank it plain, grateful for what it offered. It was a tonic for the tired, a light soup for those who had more hunger than food. During lean seasons, it became the first course and sometimes the only course. It carried vitamins, flavor, and memory in one humble bowl. Pea hull broth showed the wisdom in using everything, even what others called waste. It was not fancy, but it was faithful, feeding families with nothing more than time, heat, and care. The warmth of it settled deep, a quiet kind of comfort that made the world feel generous again. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Pokeweed greens offered one of the first fresh tastes of spring for people living with few supplies after a long winter. Young pokeweed shoots emerged early and plentifully, but they carried natural toxins that required careful boiling in several changes of water. Enslaved cooks, drawing on African knowledge of wild plants, mastered this technique to create a tender, spinach-like dish that supplied vital vitamins when gardens were only beginning to grow. Seasoned with a bit of salt pork or a sprinkle of wild herbs, poke greens became a welcome sign of the changing season. Long after emancipation, poke salad festivals in Appalachia and the Deep South celebrated this once humble plant, turning a survival ingredient into a community tradition. The careful preparation taught by generations of African American cooks is still followed today, preserving both safety and flavor. Pokeweed greens remind us that deep botanical knowledge and patient cooking transformed a potentially dangerous weed into nourishing food that helped sustain families through the hardest times. Eggshell pudding was an act of pure ingenuity, a sweet custard built from things no one thought could be used. Families saved eggshells, washed and dried them, then ground them into powder for extra calcium. That powder went into milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred together until it thickened over the stove. It set in jars or bowls, smooth and pale, a dessert that looked humble but held the taste of patience. It was soft, slightly sweet, and carried the faint scent of vanilla if a family could afford it. Children thought it was magic, how scraps turned into something good. It filled more than bellies. It filled hearts with gratitude. Eggshell pudding was the promise that nothing had to go to waste, that even the smallest fragments had purpose. In every spoonful was the spirit of endurance, a quiet hymn to survival sung right from the kitchen stove. Hogmaw stew was a dish that took something most would discard and transformed it into a centerpiece for the table. Hogmaw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was cleaned carefully, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, and spices before being simmered until tender. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply flavorful, stretching small amounts of ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire family. In times when money was scarce, Hogmaw stew allowed families to make use of what they had, proving that nothing from the animal went to waste. It was often served at gatherings where one pot had to go far, reminding everyone of the value of sharing and stretching food. The dish carried cultural roots tied to both survival and celebration, a reminder that even hard times could produce food that comforted and united. Hogmaw stew was not fancy, but it represented ingenuity, thrift, and strength in the face of want. Corncob jelly turned what most people threw away into a shimmering golden spread that brightened plain breads and biscuits. After kernels were cut from the cob for other uses, the remaining cores were boiled for a long time to draw out natural starch and pectin. The liquid was strained, sweetened with a modest amount of sugar or honey when available, and cooked again until it thickened into a soft jelly with a delicate corn flavor. Enslaved cooks perfected this transformation, ensuring nothing went to waste and every scrap contributed to nourishment. Long after emancipation, rural homesteaders and Depression-era families embraced corncob jelly as a thrifty delicacy, and it still appears at Southern craft fairs and heritage festivals. The gentle sweetness and faintly toasted aroma offer a taste of memory and ingenuity. Corncob jelly proves that culinary creativity can turn the most humble remnants of the harvest into something beautiful, a spread that honors the perseverance of those who found flavor and comfort in the very parts of the plant others overlooked. Buttermilk cornbread baked in cast iron anchored countless suppers with its golden crust and tangy bite. The heavy skillet, seasoned from years of use, gave the bread a flavor impossible to match in a modern pan. Families stirred cornmeal with fresh buttermilk, a little lard, and a pinch of salt, then listened for the satisfying hiss as the batter hit hot iron. The result was a loaf both crisp at the edges and tender inside, perfect for soaking up potlikker from simmered greens or for eating plain with a drizzle of cane syrup. Grandmothers often taught their grandchildren to test the heat of the skillet by flicking in a few drops of water, a small ritual that connected generations. On Sundays after church, the scent of baking cornbread drifted through neighborhoods, promising a meal that united family and friends. Today, prepackaged mixes and quick breads have replaced the slow, careful method that once defined African American kitchens, and the art of true cast iron cornbread grows rarer with each passing year. Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler. Catfish stew was a hearty dish that brought riverside living directly into the kitchen. Catfish was plentiful in southern waters and could be caught by hand or with simple nets, making it accessible to families with little money. The fish was simmered in a tomato-based broth with onions, peppers, and sometimes potatoes, creating a stew that was filling and flavorful. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a meal that could feed many people from just a few ingredients. Catfish stew represented more than thrift. It symbolized self-sufficiency and the ability to survive off the land and water. For Black families, it was also a dish tied to community, as fishing trips often brought people together. The stew carried smoky, tangy flavors that warmed the soul, reminding everyone at the table of home. In times of hardship, catfish stew was both sustenance and tradition, feeding generations with simple but powerful nourishment. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and old-world methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. If these dishes warmed your soul, comment your favorite and subscribe so we can keep tasting history together.